Now let's take a deeper look at ATP and how ATP as an energy-containing molecule is capable of driving these metabolic reactions. First, I'd like you to answer this question. Which of these describes an exergonic reaction? Pause here and answer on Socrative. Good. An exergonic reaction is a reaction in which the reactants have higher free energy than the products. Another word for this would be spontaneous. Now, which of these would be an example of an exergonic reaction? Good. The hydrolysis of ATP. You already know that the phosphate groups that we talked about in our macromolecule lectures are high energy containing groups. Take a look at this molecule of ATP. There are 3 phosphate groups, hence the term adenosine triphosphate. These phosphate groups each have 5 bonds and a negative charge. So this triphosphate group holds a lot of free energy. Now, when one of these phosphate groups is removed, that phosphate group's removal leaves behind a molecule of ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. There are going to be fewer bonds and fewer charges in the molecule of ADP because of the loss of that phosphate group. No single bond or functional group has free energy of its own that can be used to do work. ATP has a lot of free energy because it has 3 phosphate groups. ADP has less energy because it has only 2. But there's nothing about the bond that was broken when we lost a phosphate group, or about the phosphate group itself and its energy that's responsible for that free energy. So tell me on Socrative, which reaction can break bonds, like the bond that attaches the terminal phosphate of ATP? Hopefully you'll remember that this is hydrolysis. There's going to be a water molecule that's used and expended in the breakage of this bond, and this is a breaking event, so we would call this hydrolysis, right? Hydrolysis, lysis, to break apart. Dehydration synthesis is the reaction that creates a new bond between monomers, and hydraulic synthesis has the same problem. Synthesis means to create, so this is not a synthesis reaction. Now, energy isn't created here, so you'll take a look at this reaction and see that ATP and water are reactants. Our products are ADP, an inorganic phosphate, and energy. But that energy is just going to be a representation of the extra energy. Remember, ATP had a lot of free energy. ADP has less, but there's no energy in that phosphate group all by itself, which is what an inorganic phosphate is. So where exactly is it that this energy has gone? Well, that extra energy is going to be used in a process called energy coupling. Energy coupling can be a slightly challenging process to understand. I do highly recommend the Khan Academy's tutorial of this as an opportunity for you to seek some extra help. Your textbook is also a good resource, and we're going to walk through this now step by step. Energy coupling is the use of an exergonic reaction to drive an endergonic one. Recall that an exergonic reaction involves the release of energy, and an endergonic reaction requires input. So we're going to be using the energy released from the exergonic reaction to help the endergonic one occur. We're going to be doing this by using ATP. But since we want to couple these 2 reactions, an exergonic one to an endergonic one, we need to do something that actually connects the exergonic reaction to the endergonic. Recall that we went from a molecule of ATP to ADP. The ADP has lower free energy than ATP, so there's extra. But if we just let this extra energy float around, it would be lost to its surroundings. Instead, we're going to transfer that chemical energy by transferring it with that phosphate and attaching it to an intermediate molecule. This intermediate can be the reactant of an endergonic reaction, and this right here is the actual coupling event of energy coupling. So ATP drives endergonic reactions by phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is simply the transfer of a phosphate group to another molecule, in this case, a reactant. We call that recipient molecule a phosphorylated intermediate. Now, this process is going to add energy into the system of an otherwise endergonic reaction. But recall that that energy isn't being created in this addition. It's simply that the hydrolysis of ATP is exergonic enough that there's energy which becomes released and is used to drive the endergonic reaction. And the totality of these two together will actually be exergonic. So let's take a look at how we can use this process to drive an endergonic reaction. When we take a look at the synthesis of glutamine, it requires a new bond be formed between glutamic acid and ammonia. So glutamic acid and ammonia are our reactants. In order for us to create this as an energy coupling, we first need to have a hydrolysis of ATP. That breakdown of ATP results in ADP, energy, and a phosphate. But in order for us to couple that energy to another reaction, we attach the phosphate onto one of our reactants. In this case, that's going to be our glutamic acid, the little pink triangle. This glutamic acid with a phosphate group attached is known as phosphorylated. And since this is the intermediate connecting the two, we call it a phosphorylated intermediate. That addition of the phosphate brings with it the energy that was released from the hydrolysis of ATP. And now our reactant, the phosphorylated intermediate, itself has higher free energy. The fact that our phosphorylated intermediate has higher free energy actually causes the reaction to attach the ammonia to create glutamine to become exergonic itself. The totality of this entire reaction is exergonic because the hydrolysis of ATP is so exergonic. There's lots of different work that can be done in the cell doing this. Not only an example being the synthesis of larger molecules like you just saw, but transport, proteins that do active forms of transport proteins, can use this coupling mechanism. You saw an example of this when we looked at the sodium-potassium pump. When the pump becomes a phosphorylated intermediate, it changes its shape and it carries molecules from an area of low concentration into high. So this is against the concentration gradient. And then when that phosphate is released, the molecule goes back to its more stable conformation and it goes back to that low energy state. A similar process is used to phosphorylate the motor proteins that walk along cytoskeletal components. The addition of the phosphate causes that molecule to enter a different shape, a higher free energy shape, and the release of the phosphate, it goes back to its more stable, lower free energy state. ATP is hydrolyzed, which means the bonds inside of that ATP are broken during this process. It is a renewable resource, and you can reattach that phosphate, but it requires energy be put back into the system in order to do so. We're going to have an entire lecture on the catabolic reactions that are capable of going through and regenerating ATP, But when you look at energy coupling, that molecule is actually broken apart. We can plot this process of a reaction using our understanding of energy to get a better visualization of how this works. This is an example of a reaction curve. Along the x-axis is the progress of the reaction. We start at reactants and go through something known as a transition state. This transition state is going to be an intermediate on the way to producing products. On the y-axis is the free energy. So you can see the amount of free energy that's contained in the reactants and the products. This transition state is going to be higher in free energy than either one. And we're going to come back to this transition state and the amount of energy that you have to go through, which is known as activation energy, when we talk about enzymes in our next video. On Socrative, I want you to take a look at this enzyme, or at this reaction, the amount of energy, free energy in the reactants, and the amount of free energy in the products, and tell me, would this reaction be endergonic or exergonic? And if so, would this reaction be spontaneous? Pause the video and come back. So hopefully you've recognized that we have a greater amount of free energy in the reactants than we do the products. This means that there will be a net release in energy, and so this would be an exergonic reaction. The release of energy also tells us that this reaction will occur on its own. We don't need to add energy into the system, so this would be spontaneous. There's nothing here that tells us about the speed of the reaction, but a higher activation energy, a transition state that requires a lot of energy to be put in, would be a slower reaction. Now, I want you to think about this problem for a minute. Really pause the video and see if you can't try to come up with a solution for yourself. I'd like you to think about what it is that ATP would do to this reaction curve. ATP allows reactions to proceed. So how will the process of energy coupling change the reaction curve you see here? Challenge yourself, pause the video, and draw the reaction curve. Maybe you drew a little something like this. Remember that the hydrolysis of ATP is exergonic, and that the term energy coupling refers to the process by which the energy released from the transfer of a high free energy ATP to a low free energy ADP is that phosphorylation of a reactant. When we phosphorylate our reactant, we add that energy into the system. So these reactants will go higher on our energy scale, and this actually allows the reaction to be higher than that activation energy and to proceed not only spontaneously, but rapidly.